Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? Yeah, thank you. Thanks for joining us, people in the room and online, for our special session on public service productivity. And this is something that's quite close to my heart. So for the last 2 years, I've been working on the Public Service Productivity Review. And now I still work at the ONS, and I'm temporarily leading the Wellbeing, Innovation and Productivity Division. We're going to run the session slightly differently to some of the other sessions you might have seen today. So we're doing it in a sort of a hybrid fashion. So I'm going to start with a short 10-minute introduction to what is public service productivity and the review that we've undertaken. And then we're going to have a deep dive into 2 areas of the review that we implemented. So one is related to Social Security Administration, which Freddy will lead us through. Then we'll talk about education service area, which Adam will cover. And then we'll move on to talking about police productivity. And that part is in 2 parts as well. So we'll hear from my colleague Niall, who's going to talk about our plans for better productivity measurement, and then hand over to Matt, who's at the Centre for Police Productivity, who will talk about that the more the benefits and the implications of productivity. So moving slightly away from the measurement side. What I'll do then is I'll assemble everyone as a panel for us to do some Q&A. There will be opportunity for questions after each section, but we'll keep those questions quite brief, if that's okay, and leave the main questions to the panel at the end. And of course, if you've got any other questions, you can always find us after the event or follow up via email. So let me start by taking you through a bit of an overview of the Public Service Productivity Review. And I appreciate that a lot of people in the audience will know a lot about this already. We've presented at ESCoE last year, and we've had our own event as well. So it may be that you've heard a lot about this. So apologies if this isn't new to you, but at the same time, public service productivity is quite a complex area and can be quite hard to measure. So it's worth doing a little bit of background for newbies in the audience who perhaps haven't come across this before. So if we're thinking about the public services, they make up about 20% of the economy. And the former UK Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, was really interested in making sure we could think about measuring the productivity of that part of the economy, because it's such a large chunk. And when we started delving into that, realised that measurement in this area is very hard, but without accurate measurement, it's hard to make policy decisions on how to improve that productivity. Should say though, the UK has a strong base here. We considered a bit of gold standard in measurement of public service productivity, which started with the Atkinson Review in 2005, which set out recommendations which were implemented within ONS over the last 2 decades. Although this review really sort of reignited the work into improving the measurement. So I'm just going to, I usually bring up a simple slide on how you measure public service productivity, and I think it's in someone else's slide deck, so I'm pleased about that, which is that in general productivity is outputs divided by inputs. So what did you get out, what did you put in? In public service productivity, that still holds, but there's a couple of key differences. So first of all, on the input side, we take a fully comprehensive input approach, so it's similar to total factor productivity. So we take into account labour, intermediate consumption, and capital consumed on the input side. And those inputs can be, in an ideal world, directly measured. So for labour, we try and get direct measurement of the number of staff working in those particular things. and with the suitable wage, disaggregated if we can by perhaps grade or role. And then where we don't have those direct, we have indirect, which will be related to taking a current price and then using a most suitable deflator to get us to a volume for that. On the output side, I'll try not to use education because Adam will be talking a lot more about education. So if we think about this in terms of tax, you would think of it, and we could think about output in terms of the number of taxpayers, or if it was a different type of tax, then the number of tax being collected as an output. That's fine, but we want to go one step beyond. So in public services, we are interested in the quality and how that links to outcomes. So in hospitals, for example, you might have an operation, that would be an output, fairly costly output. If it's a very successful operation that leads to extended quality of life and it's delivered in a way that is gives a lot of patient satisfaction, we want to have that as an additional component. So we call that quality adjusted output, and we weight those, and we disaggregate by service area, and the level of which we are able to move to a quality adjusted outcomes is different for each one. So just to set the scene in terms of what public service productivity looks like, in terms of where we are in terms of related to 1997, which is where our service series begins. You can see the main trends to take away from this, if you've not seen this sort of chart before, is public service productivity did increase from the 2010s following a period of austerity. And this was driven mainly by reduction in input as opposed to accelerated growth in output. And that was the trend until we hit the pandemic, which was a big shock, obviously, to the whole economy. In public service productivity, we saw a switch of activities. So in hospitals, for example, they moved from doing routine pre-planned operations to immediate critical care. So we saw a big fall in productivity. Also, at the same time, inputs really increased. So inputs, for example, buying PPE, every service had to adapt to new ways of working, big increase in inputs. And so you had this big fall in productivity post-pandemic, which has recovered to some extent, but we're not back at pre-pandemic levels. I would say here as well that breaking it down by service area, it's not a uniform picture across the board. So we have winners and losers. So some service areas, for example, health, have had a long-term productivity strength compared to another service area like the prison service, which has seen a long-term productivity decline. And just to briefly touch on the impact of our review. So the review took a service area by service area approach. We had specific service areas that were tackled first. So Social Security Administration, which Freddy will talk about, taxation, were our highest priority areas, along with education and healthcare. We've implemented a range of improvements to inputs, outputs, and quality adjusted outputs, and came up with several new recommendations. But what this chart shows is actually overall, you might see that the revisions are a bit smaller than perhaps you might expect with such big changes that we were able to implement. I think that reflects a partial good news story, you know, the fact that we were already measuring it quite well, particularly in healthcare, which is our biggest service area, contributes about 40%. But also, it also shows that there could be potentially more work to be done on the measurement side. And the review has, we still have about 80 recommendations outstanding, which we'll be taking forward. I won't touch on this because this is just to highlight where we had those differentials in revisions. But the two biggest areas are education and social security administration, which Freddie and Adam will cover in their section. So this is a bit of a background to the review. I'd already mentioned that in 2005 we had the Atkinson review, which really shaped the agenda here, talking about quality adjustment. And post-Atkinson, there was a real push for improving healthcare and education, which was implemented. Following the Bean review in 2016, we had further investment where we were able to introduce new measures for public order and safety and adult social care and children's social care. So progress has been maintained, but the review really did give us that chance to have a really look, first of all, at the big measurement challenges that perhaps we hadn't had a chance to grapple with during Atkinson's period, but also this came at a time of COVID, so a lot of the way we measured things and the assumptions we made had to be revisited because of COVID. So our report was published on the 13th of March, and we had a launch event which we have a slide deck for, which people can access. Also, if anyone wants a hard copy of the report, we're happy to send them out to people as well. And we released our latest data at the end of March, which incorporated those new estimates. I think that just to touch on some of the other areas of the review, we report on our data on what we call a COFOG basis, so it's linked to the classification for government, and there's a review going on with the UN about looking at that. So the review gave us an opportunity to feed into that and make recommendations, particularly on new services that have been in the last review of COFOG weren't taken into account to much extent, such as environment. So we've been able to make recommendations, and we made recommendations around splitting policing and immigration. That was one element. Just to picking out some of these other things, the other elements which you may have heard of other sessions, if you came to hear Ellis talk about the Public Sector Management Practices Survey. Yesterday, we launched 2 new surveys, so the Management Practices Survey for the public sector, and also we did a public sector time use study, so for people who work in the public sector, find out how they spend their time. And linked to both those studies, there was a bit of a forward look to thinking about automation and potential use for AI. So there's certainly lots of opportunities. I'd also, at this point, take the opportunity to say the review was much of the success of the review was because of the cross-government working. So we had really good collaboration across government and beyond, so with academics and other bodies. I think I've covered all the major deliverables of the review, but the only thing that I was going to highlight in addition to this slide was around the fact that you may have noticed that on the chart I showed with our latest data, I'll just pop back to that one, on this chart, our latest annual data is 2022, so when we published at the end of March, some of the criticism is, why just 22? That's not very timely. So we've done a lot of work on improving our quarterly and making that a more timely measure. So in our latest quarterly publication that went out on the 8th of May, we were able to include annual nowcast up to 24, which significantly improves that decision-making base. Okay, I think that's all I'm covering in my section. So as said, I will happily take clarification questions or introductory questions here, but we will have a panel session for more in-depth questions. So if there are any questions now, feel free to ask one. Yeah, one in the middle.
I just had a question on the AI automation point.
Yeah.
What were some of the key findings, and do you think there's any risk of so-called so-so automation, where there's automation leading to a fall in quality of service delivered?
Oh, interesting. So I'm not sure on the second point. I think that's really that is really interesting. So a lot of the stuff was around appetite and barriers to automation, around to use of AI. I think that it just shows that it's an area that is still very new in the public sector, and some parts of government are really like at the forefront of this. So there's stuff we can learn from them to pass on to others. And the part around automation as well is that from the time use study, what they were looking at was seeing to what extent parts of their work could be automated. So thinking about looking at where there could be productivity gains in there. And that was sort of mixed results. I don't think there was the clear like silver bullet that was like, oh yeah, clearly all of this stuff can be automated and that's the answer to everything. So a lot of mixed messages really. Okay, I will at this point invite Freddy to come up and talk about Social Security Administration.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Freddy Farias Arias, economist at the ONS, and I'll be walking us through alternatives to cost weighting for Social Security Administration, and particularly walk us through the innovation in this particular service area where we used a benefit-weighted approach, and we'll unpack some of those details throughout the slides. I will first cover a bit of background of what SSA is, Social Security Administration, before going into cost weighting and then the alternatives that we've used, and then I'll end with a summary of our estimates of SSA productivity before and after the recent improvements introduced as part of the PSP review that Katherine talked about there. So first of all, a bit of background of what Social Security Administration is. So it's the public service area that aims to relieve things like poverty, or by helping households maintain a base level of income and or provide some income support to cover additional costs due to disability or childcare. So in the UK, it includes things like the distribution of benefits such as universal credit, job seekers allowance, housing benefits, and so on. And overall, the cost of administrating these services are relatively small compared to other service areas, so it's less than 2% of total public service productivity expenditure. And that's in contrast to, say, for example, healthcare, which makes up almost 40% of that total PSP expenditure. And it probably goes without saying that the Department for Work and Pensions is a key player within this particular service area. But it's also worth pointing out that it's not the only player here. There are other departments who contribute to Social Security, including MOD, DFT on pension-related services. Now let's talk back about the main topic, cost weighting and alternatives of it. What is it? So first of all, simply put, as Katherine highlighted, productivity in its most simplest form is output over inputs, which sounds like an easy equation to do. But of course, when in the absence of market prices, particularly here for public services, we have to do things slightly differently in the way we go about measuring productivity in the public services. And the convention is to construct what we call a cost-weighted activity output index. So for example, we do this by, say for example, hip replacements as an example. That's the activity. And then we apply a weight to that activity based on the relative unit cost of delivering that activity. And the implication of that is that the cost-weighted approach, of a cost-weighted approach, is that high-cost activities have a greater impact on output than lower-cost ones. So for instance, because one hip replacement is more expensive to deliver than, say, a dental checkup, hip replacements would have a greater weight in our output index in that particular case. And this works okay, and it's sort of satisfactory if we can assume that the costs are the floor value. So in other words, none of these public services would be produced if the total cost of delivering said service were greater than the total benefits. And that goes back to the core cost-benefit analysis in the public public sector, we wouldn't do it unless that cost is assumed as a floor. But there are slight niggles to this assumption, and even Atkinson said in the 2005 report that, again, Katherine highlighted, is that he accepted that the cost-weight approach was used primarily because of the availability of data, so cost data, unit cost data, and its overall feasibility rather than its representation of value. So some of the problems are that costs may, in some instances, be biased in the representation of value, causing sometimes counterintuitive results. So for example, if one service becomes relatively cheaper to deliver over time, it should not necessarily diminish its impact on overall output, but it sometimes does if its cost weight is diminishing over time. So the recent review published in March developed some key principles on how we go about intervening when these problems are too large to ignore, such as in the case of Social Security when universal credit was introduced. So on the right-hand side, we have some key points from the review that we published in March, and it says that selecting an alternative approach, there's some of these principles seem obvious, but it's good to kind of clarify them. Any alternative must be objective, not subjective, and we must be able to evidence that the cost weights in a particular case, such as the one we're looking at here, is inappropriate or inferior to an alternative method. And we must continue to use express these values in monetary terms and also exhibit internal consistency. So we must be able to kind of make sense of the alternative, any alternative approach, and be able to compare different activities and make sense of that across that particular service area. And that's where we kind of go through with the approach that we take. And we looked at alternative approaches to valuing universal credit, in particular for the Social Security Administration service area, because we had this scenario where 6 what we call legacy benefits were being moved into universal credit. I think this began in 2013, but it kind of exponentially increased over time in terms of those moves. But also another layer to this complexity was that in the early stages, we had just the simple cases, so a particular case where you're only seeking job seekers allowance, for example, those simpler cases were being transferred into universal credit, the new model, the new way of distributing these benefits. But over time, you had more complex cases moving into universal credit, which so maybe you're entitled to 2 or 3 or 4 of these entitlements within universal credit. And the challenge here is kind of the unit cost assumption is different here. The unit cost, we only have one unit cost for universal credit, but we know there's different complexities of that over time, and that's where the challenge here is here. So what is the so in the cost-weighted approach, one of the key challenges that in the scenario where equivalent benefits were being delivered to people, but at a lower cost, the cost-weighted approach did not was unable to kind of show us the expected productivity change, for example. So we know there's efficiencies between this sort of different way of allocating these or distributing these benefits, but the previous approach, the cost-weighted approach, would not show that. And this is, of course, a limitation of that approach, because delivering the same amount of support to citizens at a lower cost should be seen as a productivity enhancement. So if there's one thing to remember here in the last couple of slides, it's that the cost here is not the best representation of value. So we looked at benefit weighting. And benefit weighting was the alternative approach that we used. And in this approach, regardless of where the benefit payments is coming from, output does not change because the legacy benefit and the universal credit have equivalent weights based on the benefit value. So any difference in the cost in delivering these manifests itself on the denominator, the input side, rather than the output. Therefore, productivity here accounts for changes in costs, but also protects the value of the benefit payment. So what does the makeup of the SSA output index actually look like? So we break it down here. So on the left-hand side, we go in, we show what goes into the benefit weighted activity index, how we compile that. And it's made up of activity, so the caseloads of legacy benefits and universal credit adjusted for complexity, but we won't get into too much detail there, and weighted by payments across the legacy benefits and universal credit. And there is the other part of the index, which remains cost-weighted. These are the non-universal credit and non-legacy benefits like PIP and child benefits. And these remain as they are because we have robust and consistent cost weights for those over time, and the value those costs represent are not deemed problematic in their particular case. So then the results. So before the developments of the recent PSP review that we published in March, we had resorted to an inputs equal output approach from 2018 onwards. And that's the period when we see universal credit really being scaled up in terms of its of legacy benefits transferring into the new system. And that approach was used because of the methodological and data challenges that I've explained. And as we can see on the right-hand side chart, this approach ultimately results in zero productivity growth because if inputs equals outputs, there is no change relative to one another. So productivity is assumed to be a flat line or zero. And this is not entirely helpful if you're looking at tracking productivity for a particular a given service area. So the recent PSP review has allowed us the resource to better capture that transition to UC, universal credit, and account for its changing complexity over time, thanks to the benefit weighting approach, which also reflects what we call allocative efficiencies, rather than just the technical efficiencies, in that the benefit is reflective of low-income individuals receiving income support that they qualify for. And on the right-hand side, we see what we see in our latest data with this new approach, a much stronger output index from 2013 onwards. So it's that red line there. What we previously published was the green dashed line. And that's more in line with what we might have expected based on observations of the real world. And we've kind of innovated to kind of allow us to bring measurements that reflect those real world rather than sticking to assumptions and sort of, I guess, pushing the boundaries of what we can do in the PSP measurement space. And it's also worth saying that we developed this new approach in collaboration with DWP colleagues who, of course, know the benefit system inside and out, and their input was incredibly valuable to understand universal credit and its changing complexity and heterogeneity within itself over time. So ultimately, and this is my penultimate slide. There's one more slide after this. This is SSA productivity over time. As I mentioned previously, we were since 2018, we were publishing a flat line because of the assumptions that we previously were making, because of the lack of methodology and data that allowed us to get to a productivity measure that changed. The red line is the new SSA productivity index, and we can see that improvement over time. So we went from 2013 onwards, we went from an average annual growth rate of literally flat line, 0.0%, to positive 1.5%. And that's significant for this particular service area. In the grand scheme of things, you would have seen in an earlier slide, revisions to the total PSP seem quite small, but for the service area, these are significant improvements. So overall, I guess the key messages from this particular exercise and the innovations here is that costs do provide a reasonable floor value of an activity in the absence of market prices, as per the Atkinson review and previous work done there. But what we're seeing in some particular cases, costs may at times be biased in the representation of value, causing counterintuitive results that are clearly unhelpful in terms of measuring productivity growth. So in this case, we've developed this benefit-weighted approach that is a monetary-based measurement. It's consistent. You can compare it with other activities, and it accounts for things like allocative efficiencies rather than just technical efficiencies, and also for the heterogeneity in cases within universal credit in this case. And also to flag that this approach remains experimental in our publications, in our recent improvements. So we do welcome feedback, and we look forward to kind of hearing more views on this particular approach in measuring PSP. And I'll leave it there. Any questions? Yeah. Are there any questions for? Yeah. Thank you.
Hi. Thanks for that. Really fascinating. I guess two questions occur to me, which are a challenge for all of this area, which is about the shift to prevention, and ideally we want to be delivering the same public services for a lesser cost, or delivering them in a different way which avoids greater costs down the line. So you said at the moment this is for UC. Obviously there are lots of other changes potentially going on in the benefit system, such as the cost of administering stuff like PIP, which might change soon. So sort of why is it only UC? Because you could imagine that you would want to incentivise things to be delivered more cheaply if if the minister cares about the size of the SSA part of GDP. So just your thoughts on that, and whether this might be extended. And also, sorry, Katherine, I'm going to say this. You're just talking about DWP benefits here. There are lots of, I think, anyway, there are lots of benefits delivered in the UK outside of DWP as well, such as in Scotland and Northern Ireland.
I think I caught that last bit. Was that other parts of the UK, like Scotland and
Scotland, yeah.
Yeah.
Separate social security agency,
Yeah.
significant devolved benefit powers, and Northern Ireland's also separate, I understand. So.
Yeah. So as part of the review, I think we've done some good engagement with devolved administrations, but maybe not as much as maybe we could have done. So I think that's one of the things we're continually trying to work and improve. I think the data accessibility or even availability can sometimes be a challenge. I guess the benefit with being like, we have like a 3-year lag at the moment in our annual estimates. It gives us, I guess, that time to think how we're going to tackle, as you say, changes to how PIP is delivered as well, but also differences across the regions in the UK. But I think, I can't remember sort of in terms of the DAs. I know in the annual, in SSA, I don't think we captured sort of I think we just captured DWP, and then, so absolutely there's some limitations in terms of our coverage. And as I think the recommendations that Katherine mentioned as well, I think there are 120, and I think there's 80 to go. So I guess what I'm saying is a long way to go, but we have certainly pushed the frontier in terms of where we're at, what we can do, and how we're thinking about some of these issues, especially when the delivery of some of these services change, like universal credit, but also, PIP and other bits, and tax credits I think is changing as well. So a whole bunch of things to consider. And what I think was great, and I guess the hope I get in terms of this particular work, is that other countries are also very interested in this particular line of statistics. And I think the more countries that get on board to this, hopefully they'll be able to also innovate, and we can also learn from them, and vice versa. So we'll see where the direction goes. But DA is a very important part of our work stream, and there's probably a lot more we can do going forward.
Actually, my question was, could you just re-explain very briefly how a benefits-weighted approach can account for allocative efficiency, and what it is, what allocative efficiency is? I'm sorry, probably most audience members do know what it is.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So when we typically think about productivity, we think about the technical side of efficiency, so doing things at a cheaper cost, for example. What allocative efficiency tries to get at is looking at the outcome, or considering the outcome. So in that hip replacement example, it's not just the fact of delivering a particular hip replacement at the lowest possible cost, but you also want that hip replacement to maybe extend the life of that particular person, or their well-being or living standards, whatever it might be. So there's an outcome there to consider. And that's where allocative efficiency kind of gets at, sort of this quality side of things. So when in this particular context, where we talk about the benefit-weighted approach, in one of the slides, the cost-weighted approach, because universal credit is delivered at a much cheaper unit, at a much lower unit cost, its impact on the output index diminishes over time, and therefore it kind of drags productivity. Or if the movements are the same in the input side, so where we also cover cost, and that also falls, then actually we see no productivity change. But we know that the allocation of the legacy benefits to the universal credit is 1 caseload instead of 7 or 6 caseloads. So that allocation, how in this particular case DWP are doing distributing benefits, there's an outcome there, that cost weight doesn't capture, because you see here in this case will fade out if it becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper over time. But that's a good thing. But in the cost weight approach, we don't capture that as a good thing. And I think that's the point. So I guess two things there is allocative efficiency, focusing more on the outcome rather than just the kind of traditional output quantity. And then the other thing is around there's a change in the way DWP are doing things, and we need to best treat that. And unit costs didn't quite get us there. Benefits weights does. Hopefully that helps. Yeah. Should we move on? Adam's next. I'll hand over to Adam.
Right, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Adam Clark, Senior Analyst at the ONS. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the changes we've made to education. So education is the second largest public sector service area on the basis of expenditure shares, behind only healthcare. So it does have significant bearing on the total public service productivity picture. Now, before the Public Service Productivity Review, the model for education was already well developed, but in collaboration with the Department for Education, the review did identify and implement crucial methodological changes related to quality adjustment, particularly concerning attainment or exam performance and students' well-being. So as a reminder, to determine the productivity of a public sector service area, you need to take the output of that service and divide by the total inputs that go into the provision of those services. There's two sides to output. While quantity output represents volume of activities delivered, weighted by cost, quality adjustment adjusts the output to account for outcomes that have been achieved. In the case of education, it was the quality adjusted side that received the most methodological attention, but I think a brief overview of quantity output is needed just to appreciate the wider context. So in the case of education, the main activity metric that defines output is enrolment figures for a range of educational institutes, from preschool all the way down to the further education space. In the case of primary, secondary and special schools, the enrolment figures are adjusted by the attendance rate, and from 2020 onwards, additional adjustments to account for remote learning and attendance during periods of in-person teaching were applied to account for the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the volume of activities delivered. So this is the overall backbone that composes the output for education. As for quality adjustment, so by definition, quality adjustment is a statistical estimate of the change in the quality of a public service, and thus provides a more accurate picture of the link between output and outcomes. In the case of education, quality adjustment is informed by attainment or exam performance and students' well-being. So attainment is arguably one of the most important outcomes of schools, as achieved grades will contribute to the future careers of young people and thus the composition of the UK labour workforce. Now, before the review, primary and secondary schools were quality adjusted for attainment. Following the Public Service Productivity Review, further education output in England, England only, is now quality adjusted for attainment. And the treatment of attainment during the pandemic was also revisited, and I'll be coming back to this momentarily. As for students' well-being, so before the review, bullying was used as the component to inform quality adjustment, but this is now considered to be outdated, especially when one considers the government's plan for change, which aims to break down barriers for opportunity, and a key aspect to drive this is the promotion of well-being in schools. Because at the end of the day, good mental health and good well-being in schools is linked to a range of other very important outcomes, such as attainment, attendance, general engagement, and the development of life and social skills. So by replacing the bullying measure with a more rounded measure of well-being, we are ensuring that the model is capturing more relevant outcomes. So we'll take a deep dive into the story behind attainment. So in England, at the further education phase, students, 16 to 19-year-old students, undertake either level 2 or level 3 qualifications, examples of which are shown in the table. There are minimum requirements associated with each qualification. So for level 2, the student needs to get 5 good GCSE grades or above or equivalent, such as a level 2 diploma. And in the case of level 3, the student needs to achieve 2 or more A levels graded A to E or equivalent, such as an advanced apprenticeship. So we consider growth in the percentage of students achieving the minimum requirements for both level 2 and level 3 qualifications by age 19 years. The reason we focus on age 19 years is because students have cleared the further education system by that point. Level 2 and level 3 indices are prepared separately, and they are aggregated into an aggregate index, and they are weighted according to the relative percentage of qualifications achieved each year, which is roughly a 60-40 split between level 2 and level 3. Now, when I talk about attainment, whether it's GCSEs, level 2, level 3, or whatever, we don't just consider growth rates in isolation, because that would imply that the year in which the exam was taken was solely responsible for the exam outcome. Now, obviously, this isn't true. Education is a cumulative experience. Each year of schooling will contribute to the final exam outcome in some meaningful way. So to account for this, we apply what we call a cohort split model. It's applied to exam outcomes separately for primary, secondary schools, and further education. Now, in essence, what the model does is it will take an exam outcome and it will retrospectively apportion contributions towards that outcome to year groups within cohorts according to the weights that you see in the table. It's worth mentioning as well that this setup and weighting design was given a lot of attention during the course of the review. So when we want an attainment index value that considers the cumulative nature of education, we need to sum contributions from year groups from across different cohorts for a single academic year. So for example, let's say it's a 2015-16 academic year for secondary schools. We get the year 11 contribution from cohort 1, we get the year 10 contribution from cohort 2, year 9 from cohort 3, and so on and so forth. So with each new production round and the inclusion of new cohorts and exam outcomes, this does mean that our output back series are revised and updated as new exam outcomes are backcast into the back series. Now, the typical assumptions of the cohort split model did not hold during the COVID-19 pandemic, because without any adjustment or intervention, the effect of the pandemic would have impacted previous year groups that didn't experience the pandemic. Because not surprisingly, attainment did fall and take a hit during COVID. So what the previous model would have done is it would have taken those COVID-19 affected outcomes and backcast them to year groups that didn't experience the pandemic, which is not conceptually accurate. So ultimately what this meant is that the quality adjusted output back series would have been unfairly penalised due to assumptions breaking down. So intervention in the model was necessary, and 2 key adjustments were applied to navigate this challenge. The first concerned the treatment of year groups within cohorts that will eventually be impacted by COVID. Instead of taking COVID-19 affected exam scores and backcasting those effects into those year groups, instead, their scores are informed by taking the average performance of their peers over the last 5 years. As for year groups directly impacted by the pandemic, so during the 2020-21 and the 21-22 academic years, we apply residual adjustments so that the sum of contributions within a single cohort is equal to the exam outcome that's been achieved. So just to try and explain this way of, thinking a little bit more clearly. So in a typical scenario for secondary schools, we've got 5 year groups. You have 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 20% weight each. For demonstration purposes, let's say our exam outcomes 10, they each have a contribution of 2. So that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Yep. Now let's say we have a scenario where a cohort is impacted by the pandemic and they're in year 11 at this stage. So instead of backcasting those exam scores to the year 7 to year 10 groups, their scores are informed by the average 5 years of their peers. Now for demonstration purposes, let's say that these fixed effects are now 3, and in this example, the final attainment outcome is still 10. So therefore, on the basis of mathematical logic, that year 11 score now has to equal -2. This is a complex model, it is quite technical, and I must emphasize this is quite a rough and simplified way to explain things, but it does broadly represent the manner of thinking that's been applied to the method. Moving on to students' well-being. So primary and secondary schools are quality adjusted according to students' well-being. This was also the case when we were using bullying. So after researching a variety of sources, the Understanding Society's Harmonised UK Household Longitudinal Study was identified as the most appropriate. The reasons for this being data are available in a consistent time series format, and there were 2 questions in there that were very relevant for our purposes. Those being, how do you feel about your school, and how do you feel about your schoolwork? So the survey asks a variety of questions related to different aspects of life. It's circulated at households up and down the UK. In the case of these 2 questions, it gathered responses from students aged 10 to 15 years from just under 1,800 households in 2022. As for the questions themselves, the responses are dictated by a 7-point Likert scale, 1 being completely happy, 7 being completely unhappy. We then apply a cross-tabulation approach to determine the total positive responses to both questions. So the student needed to have given 1 to 3 for both questions, and it's the growth in those compiled positive responses that informs the Wellbeing Index, which is rebased at 2003, as that is when the questions were first asked. Now, it's not straightforward to assign a cost weight to well-being because there are various expenditure allocations within school that are difficult to solely attribute to well-being. So, for example, one could argue expenditure allocated to breakfast clubs could be used to weight well-being, but breakfast clubs also have a strong link to attainment. So after researching a variety of sources, a national funding formula was identified. This was the formula that the DFE applied to determine the core funding that will be sent to schools up and down England. And there's a particular allocation in there, the percentage of funding allocated to addressing pupil deprivation, and it's that allocation we use to weight well-being. Because addressing pupil deprivation is linked to improving emotional experiences for students. So I think the link to well-being is also quite obvious there. This means well-being ends up getting a weight of around about 9 to 10%, residual weights given to attainment. So attainment has around about 90 to 91% as a result. What does this all look like in terms of numbers then? So in the lines at the top, you can observe the before and after changes to quality adjusted output. In the lines at the bottom, you observe the before and after changes to quality adjusted productivity. Dotted lines representing indices when we apply the previous methodology. Solid lines representing the indices when we apply the changes that I've just described. So I think one of the first observations you'll make is that the changes did drive some positive revisions in the back series to quality adjusted output. This was particularly driven by the inclusion of further education attainment for England. We see some positive revisions in the back series for productivity as well, but these have been offset by changes in inputs. So the indices have been shifted to some degree, but the overall general narrative has broadly remained the same. As for what the latest education annual estimates actually look like, so in calendar year 2022, quality adjusted output and quality adjusted productivity grew by 9.7% and 9.3% respectively. So there was growth, there was bounce back from COVID, but it is important to note that roughly they are still around 5% below pre-COVID-19 levels in 2019. And the simple reason for that is because attainment hasn't fully recovered from the pandemic by 2022, and there has been a decline in student well-being. So not only have these changes added that layer of robustness to our methods, but they have given us some very important insights into the education productivity picture. So just to summarise all that, the education quality adjustment model received significant attention and methodological development during the course of the Public Service Productivity Review. Critical improvements concerning attainment and students' well-being have been implemented into the model. In the case of attainment, we now include further education attainment for England, and our cohort split model has been adjusted to account for the effects of the pandemic on the cumulative nature of attainment. And the latest annual estimates indicate that while education quality adjusted output and productivity did bounce back in 2022, they have not fully recovered from the effects of the pandemic by that point as a result of attainment and well-being not recovering. I do invite the audience to refer to our range of publications if you're interested in finding out more information. Otherwise, thank you for your time.
Jérémy Fouliard for INSEE. Thank you very much for your presentation. I do have a questions about the way you perform the quality adjustments, because when you have such indicators like attainment and well-being, you need obviously to link this indicator to the volume, right? So I guess you are making some assumptions about it. So yeah, I would be super interested to know this assumption and to understand how you perform this quality adjustment. Thank you.
Yeah, so broadly, when it comes to quality adjustment, it's essentially just adjusting our output index. So we have our non-quality adjusted output index that's generated first. So like I said, in the case of education, this is basically the number of students in school adjusted by attendance and then weighted by the relative cost. And then after that, you then prepare what we tend to call just like a quality index, so an index that represents movements in attainment, an index that represents movements in well-being or whatever it is. And then the growth rates within that index are then given a corresponding weight, and then those new resultant growth rates are then used to adjust the non-quality adjusted output index to account for the outcomes that have been achieved. So it's not like quality adjusted output is its own thing and non-quality adjusted output is its own thing. Non-quality adjusted output is the output, but then the growth rates we generate from quality adjustment then adjusts that output according to what outcomes have been achieved. So, for example, if attainment was growing higher and higher and higher and student well-being was looking really, really good, we'd have positive signs of growth there and the output index would be adjusted upwards accordingly, or likewise it will be adjusted downwards accordingly, depending upon what trends you see in the data.
Apologies if you said this, but how are you weighting together attainment and student well-being? What relative weight do they have to each other in the quality adjustment?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier how we're using the national funding formula to guide the weight for well-being. So I said it was 9 to 10% weight because, I mean, it changes on an annual basis, but that 9 to 10% represents the core funding that's been delivered to schools, and that money is being used to address pupil deprivation. So 9 to 10% of the core budget that school gets is then used to address pupil deprivation activities. And then, so that's the weight we use for attainment, and then the residual weight is just given to, that's the weight used for well-being, but then the residual weight's given to attainment. We do want to be careful about giving well-being too much weight. That was another thing that guided the conversation, because we're asking how happy are you with your school and how happy are you with your schoolwork. But the thing is, there's always going to be other factors that influence that as well. Socioeconomic background, the student might have had a bad day at school whenever they took the exam, etc. And plus, well-being is a precursor to attainment. Like, the idea is that if students are happy and thriving, that's what the DFE like to use now, like thriving, that feeling of belonging, then that's going to help them do well on their exams. So by giving it a relatively low weight, with a justified basis, of course, it's a precursor to attainment. Attainment is still our main measure, but it serves as a precursor to attainment, and the two work in tandem to give us the results that we get.
Is there has there been any work looking into quality adjusting by outcomes, as in what jobs students go on to get, or where they work in the economy, rather than just their sort of grades and things like that?
That has been part of the conversation, and human capital, linked to that, has also been included. That would be an ideal scenario, because attainment is a good outcome to include. But the thing is, though, really, if we're going to be very, very critical here, it wouldn't be as good as what the lifetime outcomes of students are going to be, because, grading policies can change over time, grade inflation, these kinds of things. For argument's sake, a student might get good grades, but they might not end up getting a good job, for example. So in the long term, this is something we would want to consider, some kind of human capital aspect. And this is included in the recommendations of the PSP review as well. But how we go about doing that, at the moment, there isn't a straightforward answer. It's something that is ideal in the long term, but it needs a lot more attention, basically. All right, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? My name's Niall O'Neill. I was lead analyst for police productivity on the review. I'm delighted to have alongside me Matt Burbeck, Superintendent Matt Burbeck from the Centre for Police Productivity in the College of Policing. Matt's worked as a researcher on the 2023 Police Productivity Review commissioned by the Home Office, and is also currently working on secondment in the Centre for Police Productivity in the College of Policing. So he's going to tell us a bit about that centre and also its importance. I'm going to start by touching on the challenges of measuring police productivity before moving on to some of the progress that we made during the review, as well as some of the priorities we have for the year ahead. And that's a really important point to consider. When we had our showcase event in March 25, at the conclusion of the review, stakeholders were really feeding back the importance of using the review as momentum to build on and to prioritise some of the many recommendations that were included within the review. So measuring police productivity is certainly challenging, and it's challenging because it's a conceptually complex area. Much of police work hard to allocate the countable activities because of the integrated nature of those activities and the multiplicity of functions performed by police. So they don't just, police, and Matt will tell you, they don't just get involved in crime investigation or dealing with crime and responding to crime. They also deal with a whole range of public safety and welfare functions and services that they deliver. So you think of public protection, dealing with antisocial behaviour, dealing with missing persons, a whole range of a broad range of police functions. So the measurement of police service productivity wasn't resolved by the Atkinson Review or any work subsequent to the Atkinson Review in 2005. And as such, it's remained a wholly indirect measure within the public service productivity statistics that ONS publish. And we assume, therefore, that the value of outputs equals inputs, and productivity doesn't change over time. And it is challenging. So within the review, we very much took an iterative approach. We knew we weren't going to solve it in one fell swoop, and hence the image of the elephant. We took this step-by-step approach. Certainly, if you're going to eat an elephant, I wouldn't start where somebody started to eat that elephant. But it's a longer-term objective for the review, but one which we're certainly going to prioritise in 2025-26. So it's been mentioned a couple of times, there were 120 recommendations arising from the review. 11 of those fell to the policing service area and 5 to immigration and citizenship service areas, with 3 of the recommendations already complete and implemented within the latest suite of annual PSP statistics. But that's an important starting point to consider in terms of how challenging, and somebody should start counting how many times I say challenging, but in terms of how we structure the PSP statistics, they're all guided by the classification of function of government framework. And the police services category within that 3.1 includes a whole range of immigration and citizenship services. So it'll include the likes of passport, dealing with passport applications and producing passports, dealing with visa applications, asylum applications, all captured within that one COFOG category. And that's the first step that we really need to take forward and improve this year. And that's about separating what the public at large would really understand to be police services, that service area, and make that distinct in our reporting and analysis from those immigration and citizenship services, so it's not confusing the picture. In terms of what we've actually implemented to date, those 3 recommendations, that very much focused on the input side of the output ratio and of the productivity ratio. So recommendation 64 was about implementing bespoke police and immigration deflators. And the deflators team within ONS really pulled apart the central government expenditure data that we had in goods and services spend to improve the deflators, and they will prove to be a benefit when we disaggregate those two service areas in the separate reporting. Recommendation 65, we were able to use a whole lot of more granular salary data that the Home Office were able to provide us, and we're very appreciative of. And that salary data and average salary data is used in the processing to weight the skill level of what is already quite a sophisticated direct labour measure within the police service input measurement. But previously, we only had a couple of different average salaries to use within the process, so we were able to obtain a lot more granular salary data to help us weight the skill level of the various police ranks and administrative support. And the third recommendation, which isn't in any way related to the fact that they had somebody from Belfast on to comment to the review, is that we should incorporate the Northern Ireland workforce data into the direct labour measure for police in spring 2025, and we did that. As I say, it was already a fairly sophisticated input series. The workforce stats did cover Scotland and England and Wales already. Just turning to the impact on that input series, and you can see here that the levels of annual input growth rate for each year in the series that we have up to 2021. And revisions for the black bar, the darker bar there, is the previous processing approach, and the lighter, the blue bar there is the new approach incorporating those three recommendations. Revisions not particularly substantial, but when you get to the 2021, you can see a real noticeable difference there on the growth rate. So that's reduced from 10.9% down by 1.4 percentage points to 9.5%. And really what that is indicating is the impact of the police uplift programme, which is really hitting home in that year, starting to hit home in that year. So police service recruited around 20,000 officers in quite a short period of time. And because we were able to obtain average salary data from the Home Office specifically for those uplift officers, that really had an impact on the series. And again, that uplift programme will be felt more in 2022 and beyond. That series there is also police and immigration combined. So if it was a police-only series, you would see a much more notable impact. But as I say, the focus is very much on the input side. There was work done, which I'll come on to, on the output side, but nothing implemented to date. So the challenges remain. That traditional approach of combining the police and immigration services obscures the message that we should be communicating. And obtaining, as in every service area, but probably particularly for policing, obtaining consistent, good quality data sets covering all those different functions of policing and trying to get unit cost data that align to those is problematic and something which we need to address and try and progress as well. So the solution that we'll be working very much to doing in 25-26 is to separate into two service areas with separate inputs, outputs and outcomes measured for each. Within the review, in terms of looking at the output side, the team split police output or police activity into three broad functions. There was a criminal investigation function that was considered and looked at data and what data availability and quality in that area, public safety and welfare, and also crime prevention. So they were the three broad functions that the work stream considered. In terms of the recommendations for the future and the ones that we'll be working on this year, there's a requirement to collaborate with key police partners such as Matt and his team in the Centre for Police Productivity on appropriate methods to develop and weight those different output activity measures together. the non-market output team within ONS has developed a proposal to cover that criminal investigation activity and output series. And we have consulted with Home Office and others, but we'll go out to broader consultation. But the bigger challenge will be how do we weight that within our overall output series? And we think we've got a plan for that, but again, we need to work and ensure that people with operational expertise in the policing field are comfortable and can advise us accordingly. We also need to draw together existing data sources to cover the public safety and welfare function and to develop a plan to fill data gaps. Again, initial research was done in about 7 areas. They're confident that they have sufficient data in order to develop some activity index and some output index to cover those. But a lot of data gaps still remain that we need to address. We've also committed to commissioning a literature review to look at the impact of crime prevention activities, which fall within that activity category. And also to continue to collaborate with policing partners to develop appropriate quality adjustments. That's probably not a year one success that we can call on, but certainly for the years ahead. Again, early research and that has identified potential data sources just around victim satisfaction. There may be administrative sources around case file quality, case file timeliness, as well as cost of crime indicators. Many of them come from Crime Survey of England and Wales. So that's me. I'll pass on to Matt and then take any questions at the end. Thank you.
So I'm a serving police officer for Kent Police, seconded to the College of Policing, Centre for Police Productivity. This was set up in the aftermath of the Police Productivity Review to embed productivity into policing, do some implementation support around things that work well in policing to improve productivity but weren't being picked up by all forces, and also, of course, to look at this thorny issue of how do we evaluate what is being productive and what's improving things, which is the area I'm specifically focusing on. You've heard it there, but there are numerous challenges to policing in this space. We have a complex mission. If you ask anyone in policing, let alone the public, what the mission is, it's wildly different depending on who you ask. But I think that the review did an excellent job of breaking it down into those 3 kind of core categories of crime prevention and general public safety. That is pretty fair and probably is clearer than any position the police has ever come up with. But worth saying, we also have this issue around public trust and confidence as well that we're very keen to maintain and develop. We're a very delivery-focused sector, so we tend not to stop to ask whether we should do something or how well we did it or whether it worked. We just do it, move on. Police leaders inevitably have come up through learning about managing criticality. Right now they'll be out there managing high-risk missing persons or murders or whatever. So when you're trying to get them to start measuring the inputs versus outputs, it's not part of our culture. There's terrible inconsistency, and that's just amongst the 43 forces in England and Wales. Once you add in the other partners, there's a huge number there in the way we measure things and our operating models and so on. And I'll mention the data issues. And then this causes a problem with national change programs. So even as we implement things that are being driven from the centre, we're not always recording the outcomes in the same way or the outputs. And so then that makes it very challenging to report later on did it work and how well did it work and what was the improvement in productivity. So how do we get the police, and this is, I guess, my job, how do we get the police to start tackling all of those issues and changing their culture? We think these are probably the 3 key drivers for why police forces should engage really positively with this. Policing wants to move towards a more evidence-based policing approach, so baselining at the front end before we implement change and then evaluating it. So all of this will require us to, of course, measure things properly. And that way, if something does work or doesn't, we share it with the other forces so we can all learn. It's really vital to us around that trust and confidence piece that we do demonstrate that we're spending public money well, properly to the public, and this is another way of doing it. And then, of course, most importantly, maybe, for improving outcomes for the public, we can demonstrate the value of what we're doing and the changes that we're making all the time to the Treasury and make the case for further transformational investment. because Niall was very kind about it, but essentially we're saying policing currently isn't improving its productivity despite all those efforts because we can't demonstrate that. And that's a bitter pill for us to swallow. So the first phase we're probably going to do is try and get some consistency among the 43 forces in England and Wales on how they deal with change. So some basic things that if you read the Green Book, Treasury Green Book, or worked in project management or anything that you would expect to see, and yet this isn't consistent everywhere. So leadership that insists on recording things properly, recording the outcomes, did it work and all of that. Triage panels so that we don't have changes being implemented unless we know how we're going to measure the benefits, and dedicated boards to track those benefits so that just because delivery has been achieved, the benefits aren't always being achieved at the same time. So have boards that continue to track it further on and make sure that we do get the benefits we were expecting from things. Benefits should be smart and they must be measurable, and they aren't always in change management wherever you go. Getting policing into the mindset of understanding those differences between monetizable, cash releasing, and so on benefits. It's probably quite common across the public sector. People don't like to put a pound and pence on the things we're doing. So that's kind of a cultural challenge that policing faces. Then tracking, obviously, things all the way through to them being properly achieved. And if they're not achieved, recognizing the learning and sharing that instead. Phase 2 is probably trying to get the police forces to explain what happened with whatever the benefits that they've achieved. So go through a simple process of implement a change program of some kind, capture what time or money you managed to save from it, if it's a productivity change, of course, or change to improve your productivity, and then say where you've invested that, and do that in a consistent way. So give all forces the same methodology, so they're all using exactly the same data, using the same codes, because of course, it's worth saying, in one force, response officers only respond to crimes. In another force, they respond and then do secondary investigation. So things aren't always consistent, even within a force sometimes. So try and get them consistently to explain where they then invested that time or money that they saved from the change program. And then, because they've reinvested that, you should get a performance improvement somewhere, and then tell us what that performance improvement was, and again in a consistent way, so all forces are reporting in the same way. So just to use the example underneath, if you change your attendance policy to make better use of your response officers' time and you save 100,000 officer hours, where did that go? And if it's an hour here and half an hour there, that means it was automatically reinvested into response policing, and that's fine. Tell us that. So we can collate that nationally and how many hours were reinvested into response policing. And then the performance improvement we would expect you to then report on a year later should be improved response times. And then the third phase, which we're working on at the moment, is can we in fact do something a bit more complicated, although maybe to you simple, which is can we get forces to explain on the national level or at the force level what they've invested into the different functions, and then the outputs and outcomes, and then use some economic estimates and put social value numbers on that to get a social value on the back end. This would allow us as policing to show, as we make the world safer, as it were, that we are in fact, you don't need input equals output. We can use analysis to get a proper value on the back end. Firstly, that would allow us to show the value that we're providing to society, because of course, if people feel they're safe, they go to the shops more. If they go to the shops more, they spend more, da-da-da-da-da. But secondly, encourage forces to make the right decisions, ones that will focus on improving their productivity. And then at the same time, the Centre for Police Productivity is developing a diagnostic tool, and this will be to focus on specific functions within policing, so how we respond to burglary or how we respond to domestic abuse, to try and identify the most efficient models so that this doesn't never change. This changes because we're constantly trying to learn what the most efficient models are. We implement them, and then next year, when we put in our force resource input and look at the outputs and outcomes, we should get a different value at the end, higher value. So all of this is hoping to encourage forces to use productivity benefits to drive their decision-making, improve that consistency, allow us to report nationally on what we're doing and how we're improving our productivity, describing how we're reinvesting additional stuff to evidence our productivity and for us make the case to the Treasury for more money, for more transformation investment, so we can continue to keep the public safe more and more every year.
Thank you. So, opportunity for questions to Matt and Niall, but also the wider panel as well. So we've got just under 15 minutes, so we've got plenty of time for more questions. But yeah, feel free to ask, and I'll sit down as well and use that mic. And if you're stuck for questions, I've got questions for the panel that they don't know about. So.
Thanks for those really interesting presentations, and all this stuff's really tricky to capture properly. I was interested in what you said at the end about the way that you're trying to, in the profession of policing, to try and think about the benefits that you're bringing and how you value those. I remain to be convinced about social value calculators personally in the work that I do. But to what extent are you going to be using the same sorts of measures that we're using in GDP to try and, or in the productivity measures to try and capture productivity in policing? So it makes sense to me that something like feeling safe in your neighbourhood, these sorts of measures that are collected through the Crime Survey for England and Wales, and the Scottish Crime Survey, by the way, as well. So let's get UK coverage. To what extent are those going to be the same sort of metrics that you'll be looking at when you're thinking about the productivity of the police service? Because it seems like the same sort of conversation to me. We really want the metrics in productivity measures, and in the future probably in output measurement, to be really meaningful for service areas, to drive investment by ministers, not just because it makes outcomes better for citizens, but also because it improves your output measurement and therefore, your GDP in the end. So just wanted your reflections on that, because I think this will make things like investment in prevention easier and more incentivised by policymakers.
Yeah, so the answer to that question is we're looking at a whole range of things, and what we're trying to look at is the evidence base behind them, and then we're currently in the process of cutting out all the ones where the evidence base isn't strong or can be too easily attacked, because it's ultimately only going to end up as an estimate. And no surprise, the really toughest area is around prevention, and then how you can draw the link between police activity and then that leading to the positive value of whatever it is in the public. So yes, that's exactly what we're trying to do, and wherever possible, we're trying to use an evidence base behind it. And it's really not easy. But I guess the counter is that people often say, well, things like reductions in crime, changes in public trust and confidence in the sector and so on, aren't always driven by our activity. So therefore, let's not bother measuring it at all. And then you end up in a conversation where you're saying, well, then why do we even try? And we don't want to be there either. I think to an extent, we have to accept maybe that it's always going to be an estimate, and accept that. But on the other hand, if it drives the right behaviours from us, and it makes the right arguments for investment in things that improve public safety, then it's still worth doing. We just have to accept that it's always an estimate.
And Niall, did you want to add anything on the crime survey or any other sources?
Well, just in terms of coherence between the two measures, I think it's clear that there's a recommendation within the review that we would be sort of taking that work forward in tandem to make sure that people don't go off in one direction and isn't picked up. The other thing that Matt clearly can benefit from is that I think the interim director of the College of the Centre for Police Productivity has got a big background and big history in what works. So we'll be all over it, So I think it's quite fortuitous, that we're looking at it at this stage, and some of the personnel there can help guide us in the work. But certainly that is something that we're conscious of, that we don't pick something that we would build into any quality adjustment that is alien to police. So we need that operational guidance.
Okay, while you're thinking of questions, so let's think about next steps. I mean, obviously, Niall and Matt have talked a lot more about the work we want to do in the review. So perhaps maybe more for Freddie and Adam, and you don't need to stick to your service areas that you talked about today. What's the next thing you want to prioritise?
I'll go first. So if I use education as another example, Freddie touched on this earlier, but engaging with and exploring the devolved admin side will be very, very important moving forward. Our education model is already quite robust and developed when it comes to the DAs. So when I talked earlier about enrolment figures for schools, that is UK-wide. And when we consider attainment, obviously attainment is a devolved policy area. Like each nation has courses and syllabus like specific to that nation. So you do need to get the right data sources accordingly. But whether there's any, the issue is, last year at ESCoE, I talked about how we used something called the National Reference Test to inform attainment during the pandemic. It's an England exam. So we're essentially using an England exam to guide and inform how the DAs were also performing over COVID. That's not ideal. So looking for alternative metrics specific to the devolved nations that gives some insight in COVID is important, because we can't use teacher assessed grades in our measure, because that has the potential to overestimate output and productivity when we know things did take a hit during that time. We were lucky for England. National Reference Test was an exam that wasn't influenced by teacher assessed grading practices, but getting something for the devolved administrations, if possible, is going to be very important. And it's the same with further education as well. I've spent a day giving lots of detail about further education on the England side, but we need to do the same for the devolved admins as well. Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, we need some devolved further education metrics for those areas too. So yeah, in the case of education, I think the area here is, I think the focus is quite clear. And yeah, there's lots of things to keep us busy over the coming weeks and months in that space.
Freddie?
And on my side, so I worked on the annual, but then also now leading on the quarterly PSP side. So there's another data set. So all the results that you were seeing, that's our annual PSP bulletin, but there's also the quarterly side. And I guess my priority is, we recently had a user survey, which is really helpful in terms of getting the feedback on users, how they're using PSP measures. You know, you guys have your uses in terms of how it can detect change and, you know, where investment goes, etc. So that's exactly the kind of stuff and detail we want to unpack further with users of the data, and that I think will drive like the improvements over the coming 12 months, for example, into the next annual release, which is March. And one of those things, or one of the key themes that came up was around the things that users were valuing more was the details of within the service area, what sort of activities were driving, and getting that specific granularity. So healthcare, for example, you know, is the change in outputs driven by things like within hospital activity or non-hospital activity, acute, non-acute services. All those kind of details are really important, because from a policy perspective, you're thinking, who do I give that investment to? And there's many players within the specific service area. So I guess trying to tackle that on the annual side. On the quarterly side, it's probably more difficult because of limited data availability. So on the quarterly side, I guess the priority would be that coherence with the annual data set, because there's a lot of challenges there in how we compile the two data sets. So yes, the quarterly side is more timely, but it's less detailed. So going back to the user feedback, what can we do then to kind of build that coherence with the annual and make sure there's a consistent message in terms of what's happening within PSP? And the other thing, I guess, is things like quality adjustments, which has been touched. That keeps coming back from users' feedback, thinking about outcomes, not just the activities and the quantities. So, yeah, I guess there's a lot to focus on, but those are three things.
Thanks, Freddy. I've got a question from Ron.
This is not public sector, but coherence with public sector and private sector equivalents. So higher education, independent schools, private security. Do the people who do the numbers talk to each other in terms, and could they be applied directly across?
Yeah, really good question. Thanks, Ron. Yeah, so that comes back to the coherence point as well that Freddy was making. Our measure of public service productivity is that sort of all-encompassing, more similar to a multi-factor or total factor productivity estimate than a labour productivity. But all the teams work together really closely. They're now all within the same division again. So we definitely want to prioritise more pieces. I think it was about 5 years ago we did this is how you can compare the data and this is what you can't do. But I think we want to update that because as with a lot of stuff, if we don't put something out, someone else does it. And quite a lot of the stuff that I've seen on social media is when the latest public service productivity numbers come out, is they immediately plot it on the same chart as labour productivity and show the difference and say, oh, you know, this is the source of the productivity puzzle, which isn't the case, but it's just the way that they've put the two indices together. But that's definitely something we want to prioritise. Thanks. I think we had a question from Bart. And this will be our last one, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so two questions actually. The one is just referring to what you were just talking about. If we want to get this closer to public sector total factor productivity, to what extent are we taking capital measures into account? Particularly, I think, for the school system, for example, but even for the police, this could be relatively important. My second question is, I'm double-minded on this. On the one hand, I love how much progress we are making in the UK on measuring public sector productivity. So congratulations, as I've said many times before. The thing I worry about is that we increasingly become non-comparable to other countries in Europe or the United States where the work is not as far advanced. So we have a leadership role to play here, and I would like to ask to each of you to what extent you're actually talking to colleagues from statistical offices or from police forces in other countries to make sure they also begin to think on how they can make improvements to public sector productivity measures.
Excellent, thanks, Bart. It's almost like that question was planted, that second one, because I can, because Freddy is off to Jordan on Saturday, just because they're really interested in measuring productivity, and we've spoken to many other countries. But you are right around that international comparability point, around, you know. And we want to, but I think you're right again that we want to sort of take a leadership role there. You know, we've got a really strong basis. So we started 20 years ago on this, and the review has given us like renewed effort, showing the rest of Europe as well that and the rest of the world that it can be done, and it isn't just all about healthcare and education, which I think previously it had. So the fact that we are tackling policing. We work with Ron to tackle, you know, start thinking about defence. So some really big elements that people had just assumed you wouldn't be able to do, we've had a go at. So I think that's sort of been recognised internationally. On the capital point, I mean, we are at the mercy of the data we have, you know, which is aggregate, you know, and it's data compiled within ONS. And also then it's deflated by what, you know, some more generic deflators. So there's certainly more work that could be done to improve that capital consumption, capital services element that goes into it. But I feel like it's there, but you're right, it doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily get the story out of it from the data that we've got with the capital side. So some of the more anecdotal stuff around public service productivity is that the big uptick I showed in the austerity period, so 2010 onwards, was driven from a decrease in inputs. And if that was decrease in capital inputs, to what extent is there going to be then a slowdown in productivity further down the line? And making that link between capital and public service productivity, I think is hard to do with our data, but that's something that we would want to explore more into, because we definitely feel like those relationships are there. Thank you. I think we're out of time, but there was one more hand, so feel free to come down and talk to us after. Thank you very much, everyone.